Hi, I'm Mary.
And I'm Katie, and this is The House I Did It.
True Crime Edition. Part 1 of West Memphis 3 Edition.
It's May. We've been doing this for about a year.
Yeah.
This is our happy anniversary to us series.
Yeah.
We've been trying to figure out how we would do this series for a while now.
Yeah, I don't know if we need to name it like we did for Halloween, but
Whatever.
whatever. Alright, so I have part 1 of West Memphis 3. So I'm going to tell you about the disappearances and murders and kind of get you started on who police were looking into or what they thought may have happened. And then Katie will pick up with the more thorough investigation. Are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
All right. I did not forget this time. I do have a content warning. For sexual and graphic injuries to children. Since we're doing like such a deep dive in 4 parts, I tried to include as much of the autopsies as I could. So there are some parts that are pretty graphic. Um, so bear with me. I put on Paradise Lost to take notes, and within 5 seconds, my husband was like, "Oh my god!" I was
Mm-hmm.
like, "Sorry."
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
so let's roll. Um, on May 5th, 1993, at around 7 p.m., John Mark Byers made a call to the West Memphis, Arkansas police to report his adoptive son, Christopher Byers, missing and let them know that his two best friends, Stevie Branch and Michael Moore, were with him. Stevie's stepfather, Terry Hobbs, had been calling for the boys to come home for about 30 minutes at that point, and no one had been able to find them. They had last been seen by their neighbors riding bikes and playing together, heading toward a drainage canal called Robin Hood Hills. To set the scene for you a little bit, in 1993, nearby Memphis, Tennessee,
Mm-hmm.
had broken the national record for homicides. The record was not broken again until 2016,
Yikes.
and I'm pretty sure we just broke it again.
Yeah, probably. 2022, I would think.
Yeah. Um, Good job. We are currently the highest city in America for violent crimes as of this week.
Nice.
But so because of this, 1993 is the first time we broke that record. Um, and the proximity between Memphis and West Memphis was foul play was immediately on everyone's minds. This is something my husband did not know. West Memphis is not a part of Memphis. It's not
Mm-hmm.
like East Memphis.
Yep. Not a
It
neighborhood.
No, it's in Arkansas, it's in a different state and it's its own town, but it is very close. Like
Mm-hmm.
you can like we if you need for some reason to get something from Arkansas specifically, West Memphis is not a far drive by any
Right.
means. Um but so because of that proximity, people were like, okay, this is automatically not good. Um Searches began that night but stopped very quickly and resumed the next morning. Neighbors had reported seeing the trio ride off toward Robin Hood Hills, which was fairly normal for these boys. They enjoyed playing. It was It was a major drainage canal, but it also had like a wooded area and like creeks and stuff. And these boys were very skilled and committed Boy Scouts, so they loved this kind of area to play in.
Yeah.
Also, it was the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't have cell phones to be on all the time.
Yep.
Based on eyewitness testimony, police were able to gather a little more information on the boys' plans that afternoon or what they had done leading up to their disappearances. Christopher Byers was seen at around 3:20 or 3:30 knocking on Stevie's door to ask if he could come out to play. He told Stevie that he did not have any house keys and that neither of his parents were home, so he needed somewhere to go. Christopher's older brother Ryan had to be at the courthouse at 4 p.m. to testify for something, and their father had taken him there. So, and their mom was at work, so there was like just nowhere for him to go. Um, Although I did also see that a little bit of a different explanation of Chris that afternoon, that he had come home from school, and or he had gone to Stevie's house straight from school and not come home right away, and that when then he did go home, and John Mark got onto him and spanked him for not
Yep.
coming straight home originally, and
Yeah.
then he took Ryan to the courthouse.
Yes. So that's what I had heard, or like my understanding is that
Mhm.
basically like because John Mark knew he needed to like head out, he
Yeah.
was like get home.
Yeah.
Um and then yeah, I don't think the spanking was mentioned immediately.
Yeah.
I think it was admitted to later, but yeah, I
Yeah.
think that I have heard that he was like mad at Chris, like I
Yeah.
gotta go,
He had
dude,
like
like come home.
he had gone to Stevie's house. They watched an episode of Muppet Babies,
Mhm.
and then he went home, and he was like, "You why are you fucking dilly-dallying watching the Muppet Babies?
Mhm.
Come on, I got places to go and people to see."
Yeah.
Um but either way, by this time that they were playing together, there were no adults at Christopher's home. Michael's older sister, Dawn, who was only about 10 at the time, told Detective Bryn Ridge that she had seen three teenage boys, two black and one white, leaving the Robin Hood Hills area, also referred to as Devil's Den or Devil's Knot, at almost exactly the same time that two other girls had seen Stevie, Christopher, and Michael riding their bikes toward Robin Hood Hills. Um, to me, that doesn't seem super relevant. If they were riding there and three teenage boys are coming out of the woods
Mhm.
before they have gotten there, but
Mhm.
yeah, whatever. At around 5 p.m., Terry Hobbs, Stevie's stepfather, went to Michael's house to see if they had seen Stevie that afternoon. He learned, along with Michael's parents, that the Byers family was reporting Christopher missing at that time. So Dana Moore, Michael's mother, told Officer Regina Meeks that her son had been with Christopher and he was also missing. At around 9 p.m., Terry Hobbs walked into Catfish Island, the catfish restaurant where his wife worked, and went straight to their payphone to place a call. When he got off the phone, he told his wife Pam that Stevie had still not made it home and that he had just called the police. Pam did eventually find it odd that he had not called her or the police before 9 p.m.
Mhm.
But once the call was placed, Officer Meeks, who had just taken Dana's missing persons report, made her way to the restaurant to take down Stevie's official missing persons report. They searched throughout the neighborhood for a few minutes that evening, before returning at 8 a.m. the next day. The Crittenden County search and rescue personnel led the search efforts that canvassed the entire city of West Memphis, but focused specifically on the Robin Hood Hills area. There was a shoulder to shoulder search of the area where searchers essentially formed a human chain to walk through the canal. And like, the way I think it worked was like they were like chained together and like shuffling their feet so
Mm.
that they weren't like missing anything. Like
Yeah.
there's no
Sure.
chance there's a gap or anything. Um, so that basically so that like nothing was untouched. But there was no sign of the missing boys in this area. They searched for the boys until noon that day in the drainage canal in the woods and had concluded that they could not have been in those areas themselves. At around 1:45 p.m., Steve Jones, a local juvenile parole officer, spotted a boy's black shoe floating in a muddy creek nearby that led into the canal.
Mhm.
So he called out to the other officers and they got into the creek. They got down on their hands and knees and began searching under the water for any evidence. Sergeant Mike Allen was in the water for 15 minutes before he found the body of Michael Moore, anchored to the creek bed with sticks. They found Stevie's and Christopher's bodies not long after and pulled them out of the water to lay them down on the shore of the creek. The boys had been stripped naked and hogtied with their own shoelaces. Their right ankles had been tied to their right wrists, and their left ankles had been tied to their left wrists. Their clothing, or most of it, was found in the creek as well, turned inside out and twisted around sticks that had then been jabbed into the bed of the muddy ditch. They were able to find all of their clothing except for 2 pairs of underwear. Police were also able to recover the boys' bikes, but neglected to test them for DNA or fingerprints until a month after the murders.
Mhm.
After Get it together. Every single thing I write about, like, just how this in the span of days, how this was handled, I'm like, what the fuck were you doing?
Mhm.
After the discovery of the bodies, Officer Jones said, quote, I guess Damien Eccles finally killed someone. I'm sure I don't have to explain this to people listening, but Damien Eccles was a local teenager whom Officer Jones had actually worked closely with as a probation officer. Um, that was his job, and we'll come back to him,
Mhm.
but worth mentioning. And that's the first thing he said.
Mhm.
The boys' bodies had already quickly begun to decompose once they were pulled from the water, and police had to wait for 2 hours with the bodies laying on the shore before they even called the coroner. Not, I guess not had to wait. They
Mm.
willingly waited for 2
They did.
hours. Um, Before they
We
even
like
placed
to
the call.
assume that they had a reason.
Yeah. When the coroner did arrive, they noted that the boys had been found in 2.5 feet of 60-degree water, and then after they got there, the bodies were transferred to Little Rock for autopsies to be conducted.
Yeah, so they're in 60-degree water, and then for 2 hours they're in the hot May,
May,
Arkansas
Arkansas sun.
sun.
Hmm.
Where I imagine there are mosquitoes and
Yeah,
bugs and
and
lots of things.
the autopsy, all 3 autopsies said, like, that when they got there, and, like, this could very well be from, I guess, being in a creek, but I have to assume at least a little bit from being on the shore, that they were, like, covered in
Mhm.
mud and leaves and sticks. Um, so all 3 autopsies were performed by forensic pathologist Frank Peretti. According to his findings, Christopher Byers' cause of death was listed as multiple injuries which had resulted in severe blood loss. He had no water in his lungs and no defensive wounds, but did have noticeable scars from previous injuries.
Mhm.
Christopher Byers had lacerations all over his body. This is the probably the most graphic one, so bear with me. His scrotum had been mutilated, and his penis and testicles had been removed. There was some dispute over whether the loss of his genitals was a purposeful castration by the murderer or if this had occurred post mortem by animals. Um, Based on expert opinion, it seemed that the cut was too clean to have been from animals and seemed likely to have been caused by a very carefully used serrated knife. I also would argue that if he was in the water for less than 24 hours, probably no animals came up to him and bit his privates off.
We'll see you in part 4.
For the animal part? Okay.
I think it's
Um,
I just like disagree. And it like plays into like additional theories. So yeah.
Christopher had sustained cuts and contusions to his buttocks and anal orifice, as well
Interesting.
as bruising to his thighs. So this was something that I wasn't sure if I was going to say or not, but all 3 boys, it said that their anuses were dilated, which
Interesting
I was
because
like, maybe that's something
everything
that
I've
happens when you
ever
die.
yeah, everything I've ever read says there's no physical sign of sexual assault.
Yes. So
other than
and
like
the,
a
and
possible castration.
well, and so I was like, okay, is the dilation a sign of sexual assault?
Or like
But
water, like
then I was like, is that something that happens when you die? But I thought it was worth mentioning that Christopher had
bruising.
contusions and like cuts
Interesting.
there. Um, but he's the only one that had those kinds of injuries. But the
And
other
it's
two,
worth, like, with him having like older
yeah,
wounds and stuff, like
yes,
I don't know how well you can tell if like anal bruising is like when it happened. Like,
yeah.
is this something he's been experiencing?
And is it something that could have been caused from him getting a spanking? Some of those contusions on his butt, you know?
Yeah, but I mean, I would think like anal contusions
Yes, but I
mean
just mean
like
like the ones
butt,
on his
like
buttocks.
yeah, but
Yeah,
that's not to say like he's not experiencing sexual abuse somewhere
hmm,
else, you know?
yeah. He also had bruising on his thighs. He had yellowish binding marks on his wrists and ankles. He had bite marks inside his mouth. I'm not sure whether that means, I'm assuming that means that he was biting his own cheeks.
Yeah, that's what people think.
Um, he had multiple fractures to his skull, including one that was 3.5 inches. His right ear was contused. He had abrasions on the bridge of his nose and on his top lip. Um, Stevie Branch's and Michael Moore's causes of death were both listed as multiple injuries along with drowning. Stevie Branch's face had been severely beaten. There was a bite mark on his forehead. He had contusions on his right ear and above his right eye. He had a half-inch contusion in the right medial preorbital region, which I think
Okay.
is like, I don't know what that is, to be honest. His right forehead, I think. Um,
Probably.
a 2-inch scratch below his right eye, lacerations on his lips, hemorrhaging on his gums, a bell-shaped abrasion on his right jaw and his left eyebrow, and according to the autopsy report, I wasn't totally sure like how to describe this, so I just put the what it exactly what it said in the report. The entire left ear was contused,
Okay.
is what it said.
Hmm.
Like
Okay.
that means like his whole ear was bruised, I guess.
That's what I would think, yeah.
Um, his mouth and gums had been bleeding when he died, which is
Mhm.
the hemorrhaging I mentioned. There were fractures on his skull and right frontal lobe, as well as hemorrhaging in the neck muscles. He, like Christopher, had binding marks on his wrists and ankles, multiple scratches on his chest. Um, and also on his chest, there was a patterned grid like impression in his skin, like something had been like pressed on him. A 2-inch and a 1.5 inch scratch on his upper back, a 1 inch long yellow scratch on his thigh. His genitals were red and purple and had superficial scratches.
Hmm.
He also had scratches on his hands that were indicated as defensive wounds. Um, so there's another one who like it sounds like his genitals were like bruised, is kind of the
Yeah.
way it was described in the autopsy, and there were scratches on them. Um, Michael Moore had similar facial injuries to Stevie's. He had scratches on the bridge of his nose. His left cheek was contused and swollen, as were his lips. He had several injuries behind his right ear and what they called a dovetail laceration on his scalp. Basically, they said it was like L-shaped.
Okay.
Um, he had several skull fractures, and his brain was swollen and hemorrhaged.
Okay.
He also had abrasions and contusions to his chest, shoulders, abdomen, his left knee, his back, and his buttocks. Michael also had binding marks on his ankles and wrists, but his were reddish brown and purple in color, whereas the other two were noted as being more yellow.
Mhm.
When the boys
Which
were
I think
originally found,
people have connected to like pre and post in some way, right? Like
yeah,
that if I don't know exactly what it means, but like that did the binding happen on him at like a different time, and
Yeah.
then like why did more blood come, I
Yeah.
don't know.
Um, when the boys were originally found, police suspected a sexual motive and that the boys had likely been raped, especially because they found small amounts of seminal DNA on one of the boys' pants. Um, However, after the autopsy, this was disputed as there were no clear signs of rape. Um, the boys' toxicology reports also came back negative, aside from Christopher's prescription ADHD medication for Ritalin. So they did suspect like some sexual motive because there was semen found and there were injuries to their buttocks and genitals, but there were no indications that they were
There's no
like
tearing, there's
yes, like
no, yeah.
there was no indication that they were actually like raped, but
Mhm.
that maybe some other things had happened or that that was the intention.
Mhm.
Um, the outrage over the gruesome deaths of these boys was felt by everyone in West Memphis. Um, and in watching Paradise Lost, I have to say, it seems the people of West Memphis are an angry group. They have
Yeah,
lots
I'd
of
say
feelings,
so.
which is fair.
Mhm.
I'm not saying that they shouldn't,
Mhm.
but like it was, it was vitriol, which again understandable, but it
Yeah.
was a lot.
Yeah.
It was hard not to notice
Yeah.
how everyone felt. All three boys were second graders at Weaver Elementary School. They were wolves in their local Cub Scout pack, and they were an inseparable trio. They were well known in their small rural community, and they were good boys who cared about the outdoors and were kind to others. Steve Edward Branch, known affectionately by his loved ones as Stevie, was born on November 26th, 1984, to Stephen and Pamela Branch. His parents divorced when he was still an infant, and his mother was granted full custody. She then married a man named Terry Hobbs, and Pam and Terry went on to have a child of their own when Stevie was 4 years old, a daughter named Amanda. He had a little sister. Stevie's classmates said that he was a friendly child who did well in school and got along with everyone he met. And said it was very hard not to notice Stevie because he just his smile and his hair was so bright and he was always
Mhm.
being nice to everybody. Um, when Stevie was last seen on May 5th, he was wearing blue jeans and a white t-shirt and was riding a black and red bike, a brand new one he had just gotten from his grandmother. He was 8 years old. This part is what gets me every time is like the descriptions of like their size.
Mhm.
He was 4'2" and weighed 65 pounds. He had bright blonde hair, just like his mother. After his body was found, he was buried in Mount Zion Cemetery in Steele, Missouri. Christopher Mark Byers was born on June 23rd, 1984, to Sharon Melissa Defer, known as Melissa, and Rick Murray. His parents divorced when he was 4 years old, and Melissa quickly married John Mark Byers, who went by Mark, who had a son of his own named Sean Ryan Clark, who was 9 at this time when their parents got married. Mark eagerly adopted Christopher. He said in the Paradise Lost documentary, he refers to Christopher as his baby. Like he was like he loved him. He was happy to adopt him. Um,
They obviously like changed to John Mark's last name.
mhm,
But he changed Chris's middle name to
mhm,
Mark
yeah,
to like match his.
yeah. Um, which is interesting because his birth child doesn't even have his the same last name.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
okay. Um, According to Melissa, Christopher was a typical 8-year-old boy. He loved to watch Muppet Babies with his friends. He still believed. I can't. I have no fucking idea what the Muppet Babies is. I'm not gonna lie.
I don't know,
Sounds horrible.
Mom talks about it.
Okay, yeah, because Mom loves Emmett Otter's Jug Band Christmas. Um, he still believed in the Easter Bunny and Santa Claus. He had started having trouble in school with impulsivity and disciplinary issues due to his ADHD diagnosis. His doctors felt that he wasn't really showing improvement with the medication, and they were looking at potentially diagnosing him with oppositional defiant disorder. But still, he's a sweet boy. He was very dedicated to the activities he participated in. Um, at the time Christopher was last seen, he was wearing blue jeans, dark shoes, and a white long sleeved shirt. He had been riding a white bike. He had light brown hair and was 4 feet tall and weighed 52 pounds. After the discovery of his body, Christopher's family laid him to rest at Forest Hill Cemetery East in Memphis, Tennessee. I know exactly where that is.
I don't know if this is like appropriate here, so we can talk about
Mhm.
it again later. But interestingly, like I do know there are some theories that the reason the Ritalin wasn't helping
Mhm.
Chris, yeah, is
Mhm.
because he wasn't taking it and his parents were.
Mhm.
Because like Ritalin for adults would act more like speed.
Mhm.
Um, and obviously for like ADHD children, it would like calm them. So just I don't know, something that like
I did see
to just
it, but
consider maybe Chris's behavior wasn't being treated
yeah,
like the way I don't
I
know.
did see that they had asked like about his routine for that day, and they asked like, did he take his medicine? And Mark was like, oh, I honestly don't know if he took it, but then it was in his system when they did the
Yeah,
toxicology report, so like
yeah,
he clearly had taken it that day.
yeah,
But he was like, I honestly can't remember if he took it
yeah, and like
before they
unless
did that.
the person who killed him like knew like it needs to show up in a toxicology report, so I'll have
Yeah,
him take it today when he doesn't normally. But that doesn't mean
yeah,
he takes it like maybe he doesn't take it every day. Maybe
yeah.
they, yeah,
And like I mean, um, I have I have students who take ADHD medication. I have students who take antidepressants, and there are days like they're kids. And I teach second grade, so like the
no, I
exact same
know,
age group. There are days when they forget, and their parents message me, and they're like, "Okay, they're gonna be off the walls today because like we did not take Zoloft this morning, or we did
yeah.
not take whatever."
I
And
meant
so like, but like,
I meant more like he may not take it every day because his parents are taking it.
well, yeah, but like, so like it might, but I'm just saying it might be something that's like normal for them to
Yeah,
forget also.
sure, of course.
Um, James Michael Moore, who went by Michael or Mike most of the time, was born on July 27th, 1984, to Todd and Dana Moore, about a year after his sister Dawn. He was the only one of the three boys whose birth parents were still married, though they did get divorced just a few years after he died. The family said that Michael was considered the leader of his friend group, with Stevie and Christopher happily following. He wanted to be a police officer when he grew up and loved to play pretend as a member of law enforcement. He wore his Boy Scout uniform almost religiously.
The West Memphis
Um,
police love to play pretend too,
mhm. And
friend.
I feel like he could have done better.
Hmm.
I feel like a circus monkey could have done better,
Hmm.
but whatever. Um, he often sported his Boy Scout uniform outside of meetings, which is the only time he actually had to wear it. So he's wearing it all the time. And in fact,
Sweet.
that is what he was wearing the day he was killed. He had his blue uniform on and his orange and blue Boy Scouts of America hat. He had been riding a green bicycle. After his death, Michael Moore was buried in Crittenden Memorial Park Cemetery in Marion, Arkansas. Sweet boys.
Hmm.
In 1994, a memorial was dedicated to the three boys on the playground of their elementary school. It reads Weaver Reading Grove in memory of Steve Branch, Christopher Byers, and Michael Moore. Do your best, Cub Scouts motto, May 1993. And it has the Boy Scouts of America emblem like etched into the background of the words. It sits in a gazebo that is filled with benches where other children can now read.
So cute.
I know. If I am ever murdered and they're talking about doing a memorial for me, I would love for it to be where kids can read.
Mm-hmm.
So, as I mentioned earlier, the public outrage was extremely high with this case, and especially within the families. I'm going to read you a few quotes
Mm-hmm.
from their parents just and grandparents. Just so you could feel
Mm-hmm.
what
The
police
vitriol.
were and what was like motivating police.
Mm-hmm.
Um because like for the police, and I think they kind of say this, like listening to how angry and like upset and like destroyed these parents were, like they wanted so badly to find the killers, like more so because of like how the parents were like going after these people.
Yeah.
um Terry Hobbs was quoted as saying, quote, "I know eventually we're going to have to forgive whoever did this. I know that and I understand that, but when it happens in your home and you watch your wife lose her mind, your home is torn apart, busted up, I don't feel it's fair right now for someone to ask me to forgive the ones that caused it." End quote. Fair.
Mm-hmm.
Not asking you to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Pam Hobbs said she believed she would try to kill whoever had done this, and her mother said she wanted to claw down on the person who did this and inflict any kind of pain she could inflict on him.
Mm-hmm.
Todd and Dana Moore wondered what had gone through Michael's mind, and especially if he had had to watch his friends die.
Yep.
Todd Moore was quoted as saying, quote, "He was being killed by real monsters," end quote. Melissa Byers, frightens me,
Mm-hmm.
told interviewers, quote, "I hate this person for it, and I've never hated anybody in my life.
Mm-hmm.
And I hate this person and the mother that bore them," end quote.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, John Mark Byers was recorded giving a soliloquy
Yeah.
in what can only be described as a soliloquy.
The
And
main character of this
yeah,
right here, friends.
and the spot where the boys' bodies had been found. And here's the thing. John Mark Byers has ensured that he remains the main character.
Yep.
Whatever the public wants him to do, he's like, "I'm there. I got you."
Mm-hmm.
Um, he said, quote, should I do it in an accent?
I don't know.
Yeah, no. "Yeah, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil. And I'm not scared of the devil. I know who my comforter is. Thy rod and thy staff comfort me." That's exactly how he said it.
Yep, that was good.
Thank you. "And I thank you, Lord, for letting me be able to believe in that with all my heart. I hope y'all really believe in your master, the Satan, sleuthfoot, devil himself." Sammy and I cackled when he said sleuthfoot. We were like, "Sleuthfoot? Saphira?"
Mm-hmm.
Um, sorry. "Satan, sleuthfoot, devil himself, because he's not going to help you. He's going to laugh at you, mock at you, and torture you. They prayed to Satan, and they had their satanic worship services out here. To me, this place as I stand is like hell on earth, because I know that 3 babies were killed right here where I stand. I know my son was castrated and possibly laid there on the bank and bled to death. I know he was choked. I know one boy's head was beat in beyond recognition. I know one boy was skinned almost like an animal.
Mm-hmm.
They kept beating and pounding on them and killing them and killing them. It's like they enjoyed it. They killed them 2 or 3 times. I hope your master the devil does take you soon. I want you to meet him real soon. And the day you die, I'm going to praise God." End quote.
Yeah, and I think like I don't know if you have this, but like it's important to note that like this was all like very early.
Yes.
And so like John Mark Byers knowing, thinking he knows, and sharing the details of the autopsy is like quite alarming.
Mhm.
Um so yeah, not off to a
It's
great start.
it's also like, and again, like I understand. I do.
Mm-hmm.
If it were me, I would also be like, I want you fucking dead.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just important to like show things that they were saying on television
Mm-hmm.
at the time that like no one could ignore
Mm-hmm.
how hard they were pushing for somebody to get
God.
taken down for this. Yeah. With the case garnering so much attention and demanding to be solved, police were eager to find someone to blame for the deaths of these 3 young boys. There were actually a few suspects, believe it or not. They would have you believe otherwise, but there were. One was a man they referred to as Mr. Bojangles.
Mm-hmm.
I
Give it
find
to us,
Mr.
Mary.
I find Mr. Bojangles extremely compelling. Mr. Bojangles was an unidentified black man who had run into the local Bojangles restaurant on May 5th at 8:42 p.m.
Mm-hmm.
This restaurant was about a 1 mile from
Mm-hmm.
Robin Hood Hills.
I took a drone tour from the
I
location
I
to the
have a map.
Bojangles.
I have a map.
And I know
I
it's
have
not
a
as
map.
quick running as it is
Yeah.
on the drone, but it was very quick.
I had a map that shows like where each were found, where each of their houses were, where Catfish Island is, where Bojangles is, like all of it.
Mm-hmm.
He had run into the restaurant, clearly disoriented, and headed straight for the women's restroom. The manager and he like locked it. They couldn't get in. The manager called the police and made a report of the disturbance to Officer Regina Meeks, who we mentioned earlier. At this point, she had been searching for Stevie, Christopher, and Michael for 13 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
She stopped her search for the boys and headed to Bojangles, where she went through the drive-through
Mm-hmm.
to take down her statement.
Mm-hmm.
By the time she got there, the man had already left the restaurant, and she was like, I'm in the drive-through. I'm not going inside.
Mm-hmm.
There's no reason for
He's like,
that.
would you like to come see the blood on the walls?
Yeah,
She's like, no.
before we have to close and clean for the night so that other people can use that restroom tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
The employee who had called to make the report told Officer Meeks that Mr. Bojangles had fled on foot about 10 minutes before she got there and had
Meaning
headed
you could still catch him.
he had headed east toward the restaurant's dumpsters. So he went that way. Officer Meeks left the restaurant to follow the path, but then she got another call reporting criminal mischief of someone throwing eggs, and she went to handle that instead.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds to me
This
like
West
maybe
Memphis is the, what's it called? The, or you just kill everyone. There's no rules. The
the Purge.
Yeah, West Memphis is the purge. She just can't handle all these crimes. What is she supposed to do?
Well,
She has to go check on the eggs.
I was gonna say it sounds like she thinks she has to take every single
Single
call that
call.
comes into her. Like she's like, oh my god,
Or
I'm
are
searching
you
for
the
these
only
missing
officer
boys.
working?
Right. She's like, oh my god, I'm searching for these missing boys, but there's somebody weird in the Bojangles. I gotta go. Oh my god, I'm wondering if the Bojangles guy was like related to the boys, but somebody's throwing eggs. I gotta go. Like, no, you can focus on what's most important.
Yeah.
The next day, when news broke of the boys' bodies being found, the manager of Bojangles, Marty King, felt that the man who had come in late the night before may have been connected to the crimes.
For lots of
Police
reasons.
police officers returned to the restaurant to do a more thorough investigation. Marty King described the man as a tall black man who was, he said, mentally disoriented. I don't know what other kind of disoriented there is. But okay. He was wearing a blue arm brace with white Velcro on it. He had muddy feet. His pants were wet up to his knees.
Mm-hmm.
And he was either covered in blood or bleeding.
Yeah, they were like, don't know whose blood, but he got blood everywhere.
Like, are you fucking kidding me? It sounds like they like heard what happened.
Case solved.
It's like literally like oh, this is what happened to the boys. If we were to make up what the person who did that looks like, this is it.
Yeah. And
covered in mud and blood.
And like I'll get into this later. And I don't remember if you briefly mentioned it, but like someone later will say, like, I saw one of the boys talking to a tall black man, asking him to get in his car. So
Hmm.
it's like,
I
yes,
mentioned like the
most of
two
the
black
other witnesses
teens.
mentioned like teens,
Yeah,
but like there's at least one witness who said, like, I literally saw, it was like Chris or Michael, I don't remember, talking to this black man who wanted him to come with him.
yeah. Employees told police that they had cleaned smeared blood off of the walls, tiles, and toilet. They also found a pair of sunglasses in the toilet that they believed the man had been trying to flush.
Genius.
Police took blood samples from the area as well as the sunglasses. I don't
Blood
know.
samples after it was cleaned up.
Mhm,
Awesome.
helpful. But it didn't matter anyway because they lost the blood samples before they could test them.
Yep.
It is worth mentioning that one African American hair had been found on one of the boys' bodies, but since it was one, it couldn't be tested or like conclusively linked to anyone.
Mm-hmm.
But that paired with like witness testimony suggests that they may have been around a black man, which Mr. Bojangles was.
Yeah, and I think
Okay.
like typically speaking, you'd say like, oh, how many other people, like police, whatever. There's not a. I feel pretty confident that in 1993 in West Memphis, Arkansas, that was a bunch of white cops. So like, sure, like there's
I'm
always the
surprised there was a
chance.
woman.
Yeah, like there's always the chance that like they're just kind of on the banks in the woods.
Yeah,
Like this could be like just transfer hair.
yeah,
But you would think that's like of note because there's no one like in these boys like immediate lives or like
right,
immediately in the case who like fits that description.
right. Another set of suspects were two teenage boys, Chris Morgan and Brian Holland. They were on police's radar because of their long histories of drug offenses, coupled with the fact that they fled the state and headed to Oceanside, California, days after the three bodies were discovered.
That's suspicious.
They had ridden there with some friends named Beth and Rick in a blue Cavalier.
And they had like a relationship with the Hobbses,
Yes,
right? With like some of
yes.
the families. Okay.
So they one. I guess I took this out for some reason.
Cause yeah.
Um, Chris was an ice cream truck driver in their
Okay.
neighborhood, so he knew all of the boys because he had sold them ice cream on several occasions. But also, Chris had a friend named Bobby who was like close family friends with the Hobbses. Um, and so he had been to Stevie's house several times with, or a couple times, I guess, with Bobby.
Okay.
Um, they had blah blah. They rid there.
They bred.
They rid. Both boys were interviewed by police, where Chris told Oceanside investigators that he and Brian had moved to Memphis, Tennessee, with three other roommates named Frankie, David, and Richard. But now they were in California looking for a place to live. They're like,
Why?
it's not weird that we're here. We want to live here. Brian claimed that he rarely went to West Memphis now that he was living in Tennessee, but Chris told the police that they were actually planning on moving back to West Memphis because it wasn't working out in California.
Or
So
Tennessee?
I guess
It's not working anywhere? Okay.
Brian showed deception on his polygraph test and Chris completely failed. During his interview, Chris became extremely agitated. He started pacing the room and at one point covered the camera with a tissue
Mm-hmm.
and then stood, according to the police, because there's a tissue on the camera, stood up on a chair and started waving his arms around while talking to the investigators. They were like,
Yeah, I like one. How many hours was this kid in there? Like, what did y'all do to him?
the fuck? He's like,
He's gone.
um,
But
yeah. The last round. Oh, also,
the last round.
never mind. I'll let you say that next time. The last round of suspects were three high school students, two of whom were close friends, and the third of which was like kind of more like an
Like a
acquaintance.
school friend.
They didn't know him super well.
Like they went
Well,
to school together.
they didn't because two of them don't go to school, but you know,
They have gone to school in their life
yeah. And there's probably
together.
only one in the like town.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to explain why police were interested in these three young men without first explaining the grip that satanic panic had over small towns like West Memphis in the early 1990s. Um, and I feel like we hear satanic panic and we're like, oh, that's like a cute way to say it. Like, but it was like it was a real phenomenon.
Yeah.
So let me tell you about satanic panic. I have never written a more sarcastic paragraph in my life
Yeah.
than this. Satanic panic was a moral panic or shared fear, like folie à deux, for an entire fucking nation.
Mm-hmm.
In the United States that still exists today, but was at its height in the 1980s and early 1990s. Satanic panic began in 1980 when the book Michelle Remembers was published, written by a Canadian psychiatrist and his patient turned wife, whom he had helped to recover memories
Mm-hmm.
of satanic ritual abuse, or SRA.
Mm-hmm.
After the book came out,
Did he kidnap
over
this woman? Where did you get
she
her?
was definitely like a teenager, I think,
Mm-hmm.
when they uncovered these memories. Over 12,000 unsubstantiated claims of SRA came out of the woodwork after this book came out, with reports of sexual or physical abuse taking place during occult rituals. Conspiracy theories began to spiral, including the idea that elite members of society abducted and bred children specifically for human sacrifices, pornography, and prostitution, all in the name of Satan.
Mm-hmm.
And because of their wealth, these worshippers of Satan were able to infiltrate the media and law enforcement and morticians and crematoriums to ensure that their crimes would never be uncovered.
How much,
It
like,
goes all the way to the top.
I don't know if I'm allowed to say this. I feel like the people that are like, I can't say this because the Swifties are gonna get me. But I'm like, this, like, I understand sex trafficking is like real, but like, doesn't this feel like the same thing that happens with like Hollywood is like breeding these sex traffickers and they're putting it in our children's books and like
Mm-hmm.
that it's like okay.
Yeah. Later, many of the disclosed accounts of SRA were found to have been pulled pretty directly from movies like Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist and The Omen. It also, now we know recovered memories aren't really a thing. Um, in 1987, Catherine Gould published a list of indicators to help the public uncover potential Satanists or even their own repressed experiences with SRA. Ultimately, though, these symptoms were very common and shared
Yeah.
by most teenagers in the world.
Mm-hmm.
One of the pieces of evidence connected to potential Satanists was the following of heavy metal music.
Yeah, because they
Rumors,
like believed like backwards. It was like these
yes,
like chants and stuff.
yes,
Yeah.
and listen to this. They believed that ACDC stood for Antichrist, Devil's Child.
Mm-hmm.
Slayer stood for Satan laughs as you eternally rot.
Okay.
And KISS stood for Knights in Satan's Service.
Mm.
And soon, anyone who listened to this type of music was labeled as a threat.
What does JoJo Siwa stand for?
And then they also said, like, yes, that, like, if you play certain lyrics backwards, it says messages, whatever. People who bought into Satanic Panic believed that heavy metal music was a recruitment tool used to lure innocent youth into satanic cults. They believed there were hidden messages of songs by musicians like Judas Priest, Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, and even the Beatles, which is not heavy metal.
Mm-mm.
In the 1980s, a committee was formed called the Parents Music Resource Center, or PMRC, to protect children from any music that contained content related to violence, drugs, alcohol, sex, or occult behavior. They made a list of the worst songs available called the Filthy 15
Mm.
and gave them ratings. The poster for the Filthy 15 is actually kind of cool. X for profanity or sexually explicit content. O for occult. DA for drugs and alcohol, and V for violence. There's a Cyndi Lauper song on there. There's a Madonna song on there.
Oh.
Like,
Okay.
those are two of the worst songs you can think of. Come on. But 9 of the 15 musicians listed were in the heavy metal genre.
Okay.
Adding
I would
fuel
like
to
us
the
to
fire.
I would like a ratio higher than that, frankly.
Yeah. Adding fuel to the fire, Motley Crue released an album in 1983 called Shout at the Devil, which features a pentagram on the cover.
Mm-hmm.
Their frontman, Vince Neil, said in an interview, quote, "Some people said we were satanic and angry. We always thought that was funny, but we were like, hey, if it gets us attention, let's go with that. We were so starved for stardom that we were willing to do whatever it took, but there was no anger at all. We were just having fun," end quote.
Mm-hmm.
Tom Araya of Slayer also admitted that their band put on an act to garner attention from the people who called them Satanists, saying, quote, "When we started the band, it was something that people were afraid of. We were carving an ugly, scary image for ourselves, and people freaked out on shit like that. Then slowly but surely, I realized we could still do this, but take it from another angle. That's when I started writing more about the evils of now," end quote. His bandmate, Carrie King, backed him up on this, saying, quote, "I'm not a Satanist, I'm an atheist, but I write the best satanic lyrics on the fucking planet, and it's great entertainment, and religion is the funnest thing to make fun of," end quote. Which brings me back to tiny rural West Memphis, Arkansas, where teen boys were being ostracized for not falling in line as Bible thumpers, and instead were listening to Metallica. And this is what brought investigators straight to 3 young men. 16-year-old Jason Baldwin had previously been arrested for vandalism, and he had bonded with 18-year-old Damian Eccles, who I mentioned earlier, over a love for heavy metal music, fiction stories, and a dislike for living in the Bible Belt.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds like I would have also been their friend.
Yep.
Damien is the one who Officer Steve Jones said, "Oh, looks like he finally killed somebody." He had also previously been arrested for shoplifting and for burglary after an incident in which he and his girlfriend had run off and broken into a trailer during a rainstorm. His girlfriend did not get arrested, though.
Mm-hmm.
He had dropped out of high school. He was working for a roofing company, and he was actually expecting a child with his girlfriend. Her name was Dominique Tier. Also, what a perfect fucking match. Damien and Dominique are the two, like, those are the best names I've ever heard for people to have together in a relationship. Damien's family was extremely poor. He was truant in school, and he received frequent visits from social services. He ended up spending several months in a mental health facility in Arkansas and received full disability status from the Social Security Administration, after being diagnosed with, quote, serious mental illness characterized by grandiose and persecutory delusions, auditory and visual hallucinations, disordered thought processes, substantial lack of insight, and chronic incapacitating mood swings, end quote, which is a whammy of a diagnosis. Damien had also allegedly told his psychologist that he had recently obtained superpowers by drinking human blood.
Allegedly.
Allegedly. I did say allegedly.
Yeah, I'm just emphasizing.
Um,
Very alleged.
The last boy they had an interest in was 17-year-old Jesse Miskelly Jr. Jesse had also dropped out of high school and was known to get into fights often as the result of having a bad temper. And he's kind of what started their interest in these 3 boys. And these 3 boys, well, he
gave them an in.
He concreted it. These 3 boys were where the West Memphis police would hyper focus their investigation. Yeah, there's a lot of things allegedly that Damien did. Like, allegedly, he had testicles under his bed. Allegedly.
Yeah, it's also so interesting because it's like, I guess I don't know, like, unless Damien was, like, 100% med adherent for all of his life and like took all of his medications. Like it doesn't sound like we've heard any other instances of him having hallucinations
Right.
or him having like just straight up like psychotic features. Like,
Well, and like the way it's
so
worded as like, what did they call it? I closed my iPad too soon.
serious mental illness with like significant something.
Persecutory delusions.
Sure.
To me, that sounds like a delusion in which people are like coming after you all the time.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so like, but then auditory and visual hallucinations.
Yeah. So then it's like on the persecutory delusions, like how much of that was actually real?
Yeah.
Friends. They were really coming after
And like,
him.
and that's
And then like hallucinations. It's just like I wonder if it's
yeah.
almost if it was like substance induced
Yeah.
hallucinations because like we don't hear anything else about
Yeah. And
him
I will
seeing or
say,
hearing things.
like persecutory delusions isn't really like
Paranoia.
isn't really like necessarily always a mental illness. Like I've been talking about this a little bit with one of our sped teachers. The last 2 years I've had a few autistic children, and we've talked about like that a lot of the times things are so concrete for them. Like I had a boy last year who would like cry every time he had to go down the middle school hallway because he was like thoroughly convinced that when the middle schoolers were talking to one another that they were talking about him and laughing at him, and it like had nothing to do with him. Like they were just talking because they're middle schoolers. But like everything was like so concrete. He was like, "Oh, it's about me. It has to be about me. Like there's no other explanation." And so I feel like when I hear like persecutory delusions, like that's what I think of.
Mm-hmm.
And like the paranoia for a teenager who is so on the outs,
Mm-hmm.
like I feel like is probably more normal than
Yeah, and I think
they
like
thought.
how much like yes, I think that's still considered like delusions, I guess, but like how
Mm-hmm.
much of that can just come from like really bad generalized anxiety disorder
Mm-hmm.
and then the fact that people are coming for you sometimes
Right.
and now you're just like constantly anxious like can I trust someone? Can I whatever?
Yeah.
And I wonder like what it is he like admitted to them like is he just
Yeah.
saying like I think Jerry Driver and Steve Jones are after me, and they're like, "Oh, persecutory delusions," and then
Yeah.
he's like, "No, they are literally after me." All right. Well,
Crazy.
y'all have to wait a week for part 2, but we're gonna
Mhm.
get into it. Thanks, Mary, for setting us up,
Yeah.
and
It was tough.
then we'll get into.
But I did realize, sorry, I did realize that since I'm doing trials that I get to read my favorite Melissa Byers quote.
Yeah. So next week we'll get into the investigation, which is really just going to be the investigation of the West Memphis 3, those teenagers.
Mhm.
So,
Because they
that's
didn't
it.
investigate anybody else.
Yeah.
And I will say there was an investigation on Chris Morgan and Brian, what's his face, but not by the West Memphis police.
Yeah, and to me, like, if just like knowing the timeline of when they arrest the teenagers, like there was not enough time to really say you like investigated anyone else.
Right.
So, all right, friends.
Bye.
Bye.